Okay, so let's put it together, right? So let's look really quick and let's just remind ourselves of what we're looking at. Our goal is to get to long run equilibrium, right? And so we can have a recessionary gap and an inflationary gap. I need to look at my paper rather than look at my screen. Again, price level, price level. So what we want to be producing is long run aggregate supply curve is that natural real GDP, right? Given that we only have natural unemployment. But sometimes we're too small. That's our current price level, and this is our current output, right? Real GDP, which is going to be less than. And then sometimes we're too big. So we need to slow down our economy, right? Because we're producing too much, right? And we need to slow it down at this given price level. So what we're going to do is we're going to look and see if we can solve what's happening here. We want to increase real GDP, and that's our change in real GDP is going to be positive here because we're in a recessionary gap. And again, Keynes would suggest that we're going to use expansionary fiscal policy, and we're going to increase government spending or decrease income taxes so that consumption will go up, right? And we're going to focus on increasing and decreasing taxes here, right? And over here, we're in an inflationary gap. And we need contractionary fiscal policy. And for contractionary fiscal policy to work, Keynes suggested that we decrease government spending and or increase taxes, right, to get us out of there. So if we're going to decrease it, that's going to affect this because it's consumption and government spending out of the signex, right, that's being affected. Sorry, let me get back on there. So we're going to affect consumption and government spending, and we're going to move the AD curve. We're going to decrease aggregate demand. Aggregate demand will go down all the way to long run equilibrium. Okay, now if we do that, look what occurs though. Okay, so we're decreasing aggregate demand all the way to LRE, to long run equilibrium. As a result, our price level drops. So if we have price level going down, that means that we have deflation occurring. Right? And we also are minimizing our GDP, right? Real GDP will go down and unemployment will go up, right? Because it's the opposite of what's occurring. We know that real GDP is decreasing as we're moving from here to here. So it's going down, and then unemployment rate will do exactly the opposite of whatever it is. So if we're going to look at a recessionary gap and what's happening over here, we're going to increase government spending because we're going to increase government spending and or increase consumption, right? By doing so, we're going to move the AD curve all the way to long run equilibrium. So our real GDP is actually going to go up, right? And if real GDP goes up, what happens to the unemployment rate? It goes down, exactly. But what I want you to notice is what is our bad negative part of having that expansionary fiscal policy. It gets us out of a recessionary gap, but we have significant inflation and price level goes up, right? So we're going to have significant inflation occurring out of there. So what we want to do is we want to look and see how we can really result. And if we see if the government policy, if they increase government spending, if it worked or not. So let's look at that individually. So what I want to do is I'm going to propose that we have a real GDP of 500 million. We have a natural real GDP of 700 million. Okay, so which is greater? Your natural real GDP is bigger than your real GDP. So where we are in the long run, where we want to be, is not where we are currently. We're too small, right? Our economy is too small, so that tells us that we're in a recessionary gap. Now, if we're in a recessionary gap, what we're going to do is we're going to either increase government spending and or decrease taxes, right? Because that is our expansionary fiscal policy. But what we're going to do is we're going to focus just on this increase in government spending. So what we want to know is how much should government change their spending to get us out of this recessionary gap. So again, we're going to go back to this equation. The change in real GDP equals, right, equals the change in signex. Now we're going to focus solely on just the G, right, because that's what we're going to solve for, times the multiplier. So let's say that right now, if we look at let's just talk about change in real GDP first. In order to know what our real GDP needs to do, take your natural real GDP and subtract your real GDP, because we want to get to the natural, so it always goes first. So we'd have 700 minus 500, and again, you can put the million in there. I'm just going to put M, right, which gives me a change in real GDP of 200 million. All right, so I'm solving for the change in government spending, so I'm just going to leave that next, right? And I've got to calculate what my multiplier is going to be. All right, so I'm always going to give you, or someone is always going to give you, either an MPC or MPS. So let's say that currently our MPC is 0.9, right? So if we want our MPS, it's going to be 0.1. And we know that because it's just 1 minus the MPC. All right, so then we calculate our multiplier. It equals 1 over our MPS. 1 divided by 0.1. How many times is a dime going to a dollar? Our multiplier is going to be 10. So we'd put 10 in here, and I'll just drop the 10 down, right? So how do we get the change in government spending by itself? Divide each side by 10, right? And our change in government spending is going to be $20 million. So in order to get out of this recessionary gap, our governments would have to increase their spending $20 million. All right, so let's work one other one, and let's look at it a little bit differently. All right, and if you need to come back and look at these for your homework, you're going to see a sheet that you're going to fill out for me, or in the quizzes, however I tend to put it in there, that you have to come back and answer these questions. So you might want to replay this one to have the highlights all together. But let's look at it a little differently. Let's say that currently our real GDP is 800 billion. Our natural real GDP is 500 billion. Now, immediately before I go any farther, right, you can tell that we're in what? Well, we're producing too much because this is where we should be. So we have an inflationary gap. And if you need to know what the change in real GDP needs to be, remember that change in real GDP equals the natural real GDP minus real GDP. So my natural is 500 minus 800. So the change in real GDP that needs to occur is going to be a negative 300 billion. All right, so we have an inflationary gap. We need to slow down our economy by 300 billion. Keynes would suggest, right? Keynes would suggest contractionary fiscal policy. Now, remember, contractionary fiscal policy is going to slow our economy down. It's going to decrease that government spending and or increase personal income taxes. That is going to decrease the G and or decrease the C. So that aggregate demand curve is going to come down all the way to long-run equilibrium. All right, so let's figure out what we need to do next. So we know that we have this inflationary gap of negative 300 billion that we need to solve for. So let's say that the government, let's figure out how much the government needs to change their spending. So if you are given that you have an MPS, right, of 0.05, we're automatically going to put that in the form of multiplier. And so, because we want to know how many times is that effect going to be multiplied through our economy. So we put 1 over your MPS. So do I need to have, MPS. So do I need to solve for MPC? Nope. 1 over 0.05, and that's going to give me 20, right? So my multiplier is 20. And then I'm going to write that formula out. Change in real GDP equals the change in, and again, we're going to put all of it, change in signex, times the multiplier. But what we're truly solving for here is just the change in government spending. We're not going to change any of the rest of it. Our multiplier is 20, right? And my change in real GDP is negative 300 billion. So again, How do I get the change of government spending by itself? I divide by whatever's on this side, divide by 20, and divide by 20. So then my change in government spending would equal, now remember we're in an inflationary gap, so if you do not get a negative at this point, then you know you've done something wrong, but there's my negative sign. So drop that negative sign down, right? And if I look, that would be a negative 15 billion. So again, if we're in an inflationary gap, my change in government spending has to be negative. My change in real GDP has got to be negative because we've got to slow down that economy. Let's work one last example where I ask you if what the government chose to do was correct. All right. And in doing so, what I'm going to write this time is I'm going to start with the same thing. I'm going to start with our natural real GDP and our real GDP. So here we have a real GDP of, let's use 700 million. We're going to have a natural real GDP of 900. So looking at the two, you immediately know that we're in a recessionary gap because our natural real GDP is more than our real GDP. So what I need to do is know how much does real GDP need to change by. So I'm going to take that natural real GDP minus the real GDP, where we are in the long run, where we want to be, minus where we are currently, and I would get 900 minus 700, which is going to give me a 200 million. Okay, it's positive because I want to get bigger, right? So let's say that government changes its spending by, let's do 20 million. All right, and you are given here that you have an MPC of 0.98. So what I want to know is, did this increase in government spending, right? Did this expansionary fiscal policy work? So if I just use these two numbers, I can tell what the change in real GDP is going to be. Now I need my change in real GDP to be 200 million, correct? So let's just do it real quick. Change in real GDP equals the change in government spending is all we're going to put there because it would be SIGNEX, but all we have is government spending times the multiplier. So what I need to do is get my multiplier. If I have an MPC of 0.98, my MPS is 0.02, correct? So then my multiplier is going to be 1 over 0.02, which is going to give me 50. All right, and again, that's just the multiplier. My change in government spending, I'm told, is 20 million. So I take 20 million times 50, and my change in real GDP equals 100 million, right? Or you could write that as, 1,000 million, or you could write that as what? Right? 1 billion. Did I need 1 billion change? Did I need 1 billion? Nope. What I needed was a change of 200 million, and I got way more than what I needed to. And in doing so, it's going to push us over from a recessionary gap all the way into an inflationary gap. So what that did was we started and we were over here, right? And by changing this much, it pushed us all the way into an inflationary gap. We started here and we ended here, right? So what should the government spending have been, right? If we know these things, how much should the government should have changed their spending is what we want to know next. So we know they overshot it. They went too far. So using the same multiplier, right? Here, we're going to now solve for that. So we know the change in real GDP equals the change in government spending, which is the total SIGNEX, but we're just using government, times the multiplier. Well, my multiplier is 50. I'm going to solve for how much the government should have spent, right? And the change in real GDP we want to occur is 200 million. So I just divide by 50, and the change in government spending is 4 million. All right, that gives you some ideas of how to use this data.